Xbox is, they're having a day today. So in case you somehow haven't seen this yet, there has been a massive leak of a lot of Xbox's internal documents in regards to multiple things. Internal emails, plans for eventual hardware refreshes, plans for their next generation system, albeit extremely early ones, game release timelines, all kinds of stuff that has accidentally made its way to the public view. And it's so much out there that I feel like I gotta talk about some of this. Before we get into talking about some of the specific things that have been leaked and the information on there, I do think one really important thing to highlight is that this stuff changes. It's not as if every document we're seeing are things that are recently made documents with locked in timelines and for sure plans. Honestly, a lot of the stuff looks like it dates back from as far as 2020, possibly even pre-COVID, with plans for this current generation. A great example of this is that if you look at the game release timelines that have been talked about, on that very document, it talks about Starfield and Redfall coming out in 2021, which Starfield was basically a couple weeks ago and Redfall was earlier this year. Not quite exactly a 2021 release. So a lot of the stuff are things that may have been true at some point. They've also been divorced from their context. Plans change, things can be canceled, things can be pivoted in a new direction. And so I think it's very important to not necessarily assume that everything out of this leak is 100% happening and is the plan. What it really means is this is something that they talked about at one point, and maybe it does turn into something, maybe it doesn't. So when it comes to what's in this leak, there's really three main things that I want to talk about. It's always possible that as we go through all these documents and how much stuff has really gotten out, might be additional videos I want to make, and if you don't want to miss out on those, make sure to subscribe. But for now, there's three big things I really want to touch on. The possible mid-cycle refresh that they are working on, early plans for their next generation system, and game release timeline, primarily just in the sense of what additional titles it gives us a possible look at. To begin with, I think the biggest one though, the mid-cycle refresh. Now I've seen a few people argue about whether or not this counts as a refresh in a way that kind of bothers me internally a little bit, primarily in that people are focusing on the fact that this doesn't look like it's a pro level system, like a power boost, which traditionally mid-cycle refreshes are not. That has happened once, last generation, with the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro. More traditionally, when you look at a lot of mid-cycle refreshes for systems, it's the opposite of a power boost. It's something that is more affordable, maybe it is just as powerful while being more power efficient, things like slimline systems, which is what this supposed new Xbox Series X would do, but with some slightly heavier changes. Titled Brooklyn, the concept of this revised Series X is an all-digital version of the system with some additional perks, sold at the same price point, but with one major drawback, dropping the disc slot. Now, I've seen a few people make the assumption that being a refresh, this would completely replace the Series X, which I don't think is necessarily a fair assumption to make. The reason why assuming that's a full refresh would be a bit of a problem is if this replaces the current Series X, that means that their two mainline systems that are out on the market would both be digital-only systems with no physical support, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me personally, given the fact that this generation already started with physical support. We have games actively being made in physical versions, and stopping the production and release of a physical system in the middle of its life cycle doesn't make a lot of sense to me. They certainly could emphasize and put more focus and spotlight on this newer version of the Series X that's all digital. They can give you reasons for wanting to get that one over the disc-based version, and in fact, that's what they're clearly trying to do with this idea of it offering double the storage at 2 terabytes, along with an improved controller, which we'll talk about in a second, along with trying to make it more appealing by being an even smaller system compared to the Series X, though not quite as small as the Series S. Now, at the end of the day, I'm also making an assumption here by saying that I think it would launch side by side, but that just makes more sense to me than completely replacing the physical model altogether, unless this ends up being something where it's similar to the rumors we've heard about a PlayStation 5 revision, where all the models end up being digital-only systems, but then there is an additional disc reader accessory that is sold separately or could possibly be bundled in as well. That could make sense to me if they wanted to start marketing that alongside with these systems, and then the idea is just that the core systems available are digital only. But I don't see Microsoft mid-cycle completely getting rid of disk support. It just doesn't make sense when it already exists for this generation. Along with the smaller body and the increased storage size, this model would also supposedly support a number of additional improvements in specific areas, like using a more recent Bluetooth 5.2, making making use of Wi-Fi 6E, and also taking advantage of a die shrink resulting in a more efficient system that can hit the same performance power as the current Series X, but doing it with less power drain, which also means less heat production. Which is again something that is fairly standard in a lot of mid-cycle refreshes. Even Nintendo did this with the Switch when they released the red box switches, for instance. Now the other aspect of the system would be that it would be bundled with a brand new version of the Series style controller, and this is something that we already kind of knew Microsoft was toying with the idea of. There have been surveys in the past talking about whether or not people would be interested in an Xbox controller that had additional features and functionalities similar to the PS5 DualSense, and that is effectively what this controller is. It is an Xbox Series style controller, still offering the same kind of general body and design, with things like haptic feedback, built-in speaker, an accelerometer so you can do motion-based controls, which is definitely one of the biggest things that the Xbox controller has been missing compared to other first-party mainline controllers, along with a couple other features that we tend to see either in pro-level controllers or third-party controllers, but don't tend to see in like the mainline controller option for a system. For instance, the idea of having modular sticks so you can swap them in and out with different designs. For instance, if you want a taller or shorter stick or a different shaped stick head, and the inclusion of a rechargeable and swappable battery as opposed to relying on the default AA's that we see in current controllers, which is a midpoint I really like. I've enjoyed having AA as an option, but I always wish that Xbox controllers would just ship with a rechargeable battery pack that I could remove if I wanted to use AA's. That's a midpoint I'm much happier with, rather than having a rechargeable battery that once it dies, I just can't really use that controller anymore unless it's wired. A couple other interesting notes with the slide for this controller include features like having a lift to wake function, meaning that when you pick the controller up, it just immediately turns on and is good to go, instead of you having to hit the Xbox button to activate it, along with additional functions when connected to the Xbox mobile app for things like checking which device is synced with which controller, being able to manage your controllers and accessories, so on and so forth. Now again, we don't have full context for these documents and plans can always change. If what was written about these is still true, this new system refresh would be something planned for late next year, 2024, while the controller would be something, while bundled with it, might get revealed and released sooner. Now looking even further ahead, there were also plans in these leaked documents talking about Xbox's possible plans for their next generation system. This is looking even further into the future at 2028, which again, all of this stuff is very subject to change or just to not be true anymore, and I think it's especially true in this case because these are essentially early pitches for what they want to do after the current generation. Could it be stuff that they've decided to go all in on and are actively working on as we speak? Sure. Could it also be something that they've just kind of toyed with the idea of and it's currently on the back burner? Also possible. Again, we really don't have full context for this stuff, but as far as what this early pitch is insinuating, the idea would be for their next generation system to focus on being a hybrid traditional console and cloud console. This is actually something that Xbox has openly talked about in the past. This was even a thing they pitched for a lot of games on the Xbox One, is the idea of taking advantage of the cloud. Basically using Xbox Azure servers to do things like offloading certain aspects of running a game and processing, and instead of doing that natively on the system, doing that on the cloud, streamed to the system along with whatever the system itself is handling, allowing for potentially bigger games that are able to run beyond what the system's native hardware could do by itself. The other benefit of this being that because more processing power is being handled by the cloud, you don't necessarily need as powerful of a device that's being used to play these games on the user end, and thus they can sell a much cheaper system that is offering higher level performance, with these early pitches insinuating something as much as a smaller device costing less than $100. The other benefit of this being that because more processing power is being handled not on the device itself, Xbox could sell a cheaper device to users and take advantage of cloud performance to really still get that kind of big, more traditional high-end gaming experience, with this pitch even citing the example of getting something less than $100 and even being something in a handheld form factor. Now again, this idea really isn't that surprising when you look at Microsoft's history, because they've already talked about doing things like this before with previously released systems, but this would certainly be a much more hard lean into that direction. And if this were to be the form that their next-gen system would take, it would also mean a interesting step in a direction that accepts the idea of their system needing to be an always online gaming experience, something that a lot of people are definitely resistant to the idea of. If you've seen me talk before about my thoughts on physical versus digital media, physical is my personal preference and I love the idea of supporting physical as long as possible, but I certainly also have a bit of a resignation to the idea that an all digital future is an eventuality, especially when it comes to concepts like this pitch where you involve cloud processing as part of just being an essential aspect of how a game is being being ran. While I'm not necessarily jumping for joy at the prospect of gaming going in this direction, I think it is important to recognize that it is something a lot of companies are going to continue pushing more and more and want to go in the direction of. And it's important to make sure that people are being vocal about, because while it's certainly very easy for consumers, there's a lot of very important questions about what that means in terms of things like ownership, being able to access content. We've already seen plenty of examples of what happens when games get delisted or even removed to where people that owned it previously can't own it ever again. There's a lot of headaches that need to be sorted out, and my only hope can be that if this is the direction that things are going to eventually go, that we see a lot of it get fixed by this 2028 date. Because if things at that point are still working like we see a lot of digital being ran today, not something I'm really that excited about. Again, grain of salt, because while these are official documents, they are removed from a lot of outside context. They don't necessarily build out the full picture and may not even be representative of what Xbox is currently thinking of. Now, last but not least, I want to touch on the game release timeline, because while that certainly is a little bit out of date in terms of some games coming out way later than what they were suspecting on there, there's a number of game titles talked about that haven't been officially revealed yet. Some of these are project names that we can guess or assume are some titles that have been fully revealed, like South of Midnight, and there are other games that are just outright titled that maybe we've heard rumor of before, but now looks like is a thing that, if it isn't in production now, was in production at some time and was being planned. A lot of this is specifically on the Bethesda end of things, listing things like remasters for Fallout 3 and Oblivion, which is cool sounding. As a fan of Bethesda titles, and in particular a massive fan of Morrowind, I would love to see work go to something like that instead, which understandably would probably be a bit more of a full-blown remake than just a remaster situation. A lot has changed in how they approach the design of the game since that title, but doesn't change the fact that if they're remastering those two, I would love to see Morrowind have its chance. Also the listing of a new Doom title called Doom Year Zero. It's not clear if this is maybe a fancy title for another kind of remaster or remake work. It could be just a brand new game that is a prequel title to other games. It could be a soft reboot. Who knows? We just know that it's a new Doom game that is being planned. And the really big one for me though, personally, Dishonored 3. I absolutely love the Dishonored games. They are my favorite games made by Arcane. I have enjoyed some of their other work. Prey in particular was fantastic. Deathloop lost me a little more. Redfall, as we all saw earlier this year, a bit more of a mixed reception, not only by the fan base, but even by the people who are working on it, according to a lot of behind the scenes stuff. So them going back to Dishonored with a full new entry, I'm very excited at the idea of. I love that they were able to take a break and focus on some other stuff, but at the same time, that is the series that really made me fall in love with their work. So if that is a thing that's really happening, cannot wait to learn more about it, even if it's going to be quite a little bit ways out. On top of Arcane going back to Dishonored, there was also a listing for a Ghostwire Tokyo direct sequel, so that would be potentially what Tango Gameworks is working on right now, which is pretty exciting. I think one of the funniest things on the list was Elder Scrolls 6 was put down, which, considering the fact that Starfield was on this list with a 2021 release, don't really see that happening. It would be cool to have it potentially that soon, but unless there was a lot more early development happening for it sooner than what Bethesda has been making it seem, that's probably going to be a little farther out. So that's just a quick overview of some of the biggest things to come out of this leak so far. Again, there was so much information to sift through that I might revisit this with some additional videos. One popular thing that's been going around a lot was an email from Phil Spencer talking about, the goal of maybe someday buying Nintendo, which that's a whole other thing to unpack. If I do end up making any more videos and stuff, you definitely want to make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. I do have some other Xbox relevant videos planned for the future, as well as PlayStation and Nintendo as always. I'm not really focused on any particular platform here. Just love talking about gaming in general. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up button to let me know, and I will see you guys later.